Okay, we are at the World Glaucoma Symposium in Rome. We have Urdu, Dr. Urdu from Abuja. Can you tell us your full name?
Okay, thank you. My name is Edo Ruth Nomwange from Abuja. And I'm in Rome here for the World Glaucoma Conference. Today is our first day. It was an interesting day. We learned so many things. There's a debate, a hot debate on eye stents, trabeculectomy, minimally invasive glaucoma surgery.
So what's the main thing that you learned today, coming all the way from Nigeria to Rome? What's the main thing you learned today?
There's so many advances, and I think going back home, I should be able to replicate same when I get home, if at all I have the opportunity, the equipment, which is a major challenge we have in Africa.
Okay.
Even though you have the expertise, most times you don't really have the equipment, the machines to work with. So going back home, even when I learn this, I'm hoping that I should be able to, in any way I can, maybe through the help of the government, source for funds, to get some of this equipment sent back home so I can replicate it.
Okay. Great, great. And you have a colleague over here. Come over here.
Yeah, she's a glaucoma specialist.
Okay, we got Aisha, glaucoma specialist.
Yeah.
How have you liked the first day today of the World Glaucoma meeting?
Really, really interesting. Really, really exciting.
What's the biggest take-home thing you learned so far on the first day?
Well, we shouldn't let our limitations judge us, I think, because there's always an alternate pathway to take, so to speak. We might not have the expensive equipment and all of that, but we could make do with the little bit that we have. Our trabeculectomies, we could use the modified needles, like I just learned. I did not know that, and it's been really nice. There's no limit. We do have a lot of limitations, unfortunately. Equipment for us, we're still battling with awareness. We don't have enough patients, but it's a step at a time, I think. So
Okay,
it's just opening so many doors and opportunities to meet with people and to learn new things. It's been great.
Okay, great. Well, we're from the United States. We have the National Medical Association, and a lot of our members do some work in Nigeria. And you do teaching in Nigeria, glaucoma tube shunts. So, we're going to share this message with our people in the United States.
Some tube shunt lectures recently, actually, and it was really, really
Yeah,
wonderful.
Dr. Tosin Smith.
Yeah, yes, we did.
All over
the
Tucson.
clear path and- yes,
Exactly,
and the Alpha,
exactly.
I was part of that training,
Great,
and
that's
it was-
great.
It was really wonderful. I've done like 5 so far. And
Excellent.
Excellent results. I was showing my colleague the pictures, the post-operative pictures of the patients.
Okay, excellent.
Really, really
We'll
well.
pass that on. We'll pass that. So we'll say thank you to Dr. Smith.
Thank you, Dr. Smith.
There you
It's
go.
been wonderful. Thank
All right.
you.
Thank you very much.
All right.
Okay, we're here at the World Glaucoma meeting, and I just met David Burton, ophthalmologist from United Kingdom. David, tell us about yourself.
So yeah, I'm an ophthalmologist. I work in New York and Scarborough teaching hospitals. I'm a clinical director and also have a vested interest in glaucoma. And so I'm a glaucoma consultant and a cataract surgeon as well.
How do you like the first day of this meeting so far?
Yeah, so far so good. I came in this morning and it's been fantastic. It's great to meet like-minded individuals and share and network. As you can see, we're having a networking session. I'm good, thank you very much. Having a networking session right now, so it's fantastic. So
Okay, now in England, I think you're one of maybe one or two black ophthalmologists I met. But how many black ophthalmologists are there in England?
yeah, so I mean, at the moment, I think there are many more black ophthalmology women in the sector, and I think that probably follows suit with regards to the work that's gone before me. So what I mean by that is that we have a lot more female black doctors who come through the system. But yeah, I'm one of about 3 or 4 that I can think of in terms of investing.
Now, in the United States, we have about 400 black ophthalmologists. We also have a black WhatsApp group. And you were telling me that you have a WhatsApp group in England. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, of course. So it's a great networking opportunity for trainees, but also for consultants. We have an ophthalmology group. We also have a surgical group as well, where we share ideas, we have events, and connect in that way. And as I mentioned before, I think the key to this is networking and being able to form those networks so you can get impart information in terms of progression throughout ophthalmology and life.
And what's the biggest takeaway? We had a lot of sessions today. Is there anything that jumped out in your mind that stuck with you that you learned the most from?
Yeah, I think it's novel therapies. Opening up new spaces in regards to our treatments. So metastasil, for example, I think that's going to be one of the go-to drugs of the future. It's a novel therapy, it's utilised in the States and at the moment, but in Europe it's having an increasing sort of generation of interest. So I'm hopeful that will be another tool to our armamentarium moving forward.
And what advice, now I hear an accent. Tell us where you're from again.
Yeah, so my parents are from the Caribbean. I say Caribbean, from Jamaica. But I don't think I'm going to have an accent.
Big up Jamaica,
yeah,
big
up
man.
Jamaica, exactly. So yeah, that's where my roots are, firmly entrenched. But I'm from the UK, and so I don't think I have really much of an accent, but you could probably just hear intonations at time to time.
And what advice would you give to young people that want to pursue a career in medicine? What advice would you give them?
Yeah, sure. The sky's the limit. There's no limit to that. Right? There's no limit to the ability to pursue a goal. Just know that there is the ability to teach medicine. There's good schools out there. If you don't find a school of first choice, so second and third choice, have a plan. Have a plan to sort of embark on the journey of lifelong learning, which is what I feel you get from being a medic. And the beauty of the job that I do is I can help other people through, but also the key thing here is helping patients, helping your fellow man, helping your fellow woman in times of need, and I feel that you are able to do that successfully in a career in medicine.
Thank you, brother.
No problem at all.
We're here with Karen Allison at the World Glaucoma meeting. Dr. Allison, tell us about your day today.
Hi everyone, we're at the World Glaucoma Congress in Rome, and it's actually quite crowded here, and today we had some wonderful speakers. We had Roy Wilson, who is the president at Wayne State, and he gave a wonderful talk about diversity in healthcare.
I videotaped the talk. I'm going to play it for the people.
Oh, wonderful.
Good.
It was a wonderful talk. And also Dr. Weinrab gave an excellent talk about where we are with glaucoma treatment, the management. We talked about access to care and different...
What's your biggest takeaway that's going to help you that you took away from today?
Well, it's not about what I learned per se, but it's the fact that they're so open to see the other areas of diversity and inclusiveness in glaucoma, and actually looking at the black population and the minority population and the patients with low access, and trying to figure out a way to treat these patients so that in another 10 years we're not saying that glaucoma is a leading cause of blindness. The other thing that they talked a lot about was the MIGS procedure, and MIGS in Europe is something. It's something that they do. It's not even an issue in America. And people are still wondering, should they do MIGS? Here, everyone is doing MIGS, and they're showing the results that is showing a 2 to 5% millimeters drop in intraocular pressure. So we have to, these are some of the things that we have to present to Medicare to let them know that we need all the different procedures so that we can treat our patients.
So Karen, Dr. Allison, you're going to be working with the American Glaucoma Society to give a presentation to the Medicare services about MIGS.
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
That's coming up soon.
Yes.
Excellent. So listen, good luck with that. We appreciate the work you're doing with that. And it's an important message, so we're glad to see you here to talk about MIGS as well.
And also, I want people to know to come to the NMA. It's going to be a wonderful meeting. It's going to be in New Orleans, and we're looking for a good turnout.
That's right. Do you want to tell them the dates exactly? We got July, it's coming up July 28th, 29th,
28 to 30.
29th, 30 New Orleans, okay?
Nearly.
All right, thank you, Dr. Allison. Okay, we're here with Dr. Nakura. Dr. Nakura, tell us your name and where you're from, please.
I'm Kiru Kizakarawe, come from Nigeria.
And your specialty is glaucoma.
Yes,
And so what are the biggest things that you're learning here at the Glaucoma Congress?
well, the new thing that I learned here is about the DSLT, which is quite novel, and which I think, if it's really effective, will be quite helpful to our African patients, glaucoma patients, because no touch, laser treatments, and then so that seems to have some good promise for our patients who don't want to do surgery.
Okay. Now, glaucoma is a big problem in Nigeria and in the United States and the African American community. What would you want to tell the young people that are interested in medicine and ophthalmology?
Well, I would want to encourage them to go into glaucoma subspecialty because the population with glaucoma is large and we don't have enough hands to care for them appropriately.
So we need more surgeons.
We need more surgeons.
We need more hands on the ground, boots on the ground.
Yeah, we need more young people.
I agree with you. We
Yeah.
need that too in the United States, South America, and throughout the world. Thank you very much and enjoy the conference.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Neil. Can I have my slides? I've got a lot of material to cover and not a lot of time, but I don't want this moment to pass without thanking Neil Gupta and the program committee for this invitation. It's really a privilege for me to share this symposium with Otis Tabuzi, who was my fellow many decades ago, and to follow the Nobel laureate lecture by Bob Weinreb. I thought it was a great lecture. Okay, the laureate award lecture. The title of my talk is Glaucoma in Blacks, How Far Have We Come and Where Do We Go From Here? And I borrowed this title from I have no financial conflict. I borrowed this title from an article that I did for JAMA commentary in 1989, in which I commented that we understood a lot about glaucoma at that point in terms of the epidemiology, the prevalence, and the severity of it, but we really didn't understand the reasons why African Americans were having a greater impact from glaucoma than non-African Americans. And I posed the issue of the responsible factors urgently need to be identified and vigorously controlled. So I thought that it would be interesting to take another look at this now, which is, 34 years later, and see where we are now. And these are the topics I do want to cover, and I'm not going to go through each one of these right now because of time limitations. But the first thing is, and then also once I do that, I'm going to do a little bit of what Bob Weinreb did and really think about, where's the future going in this area, glaucoma in blacks and data and society and things like that. So in terms of, in 1989, we understood the epidemiology a little bit, even though, many of these studies, the St. Lucia's, Barbados, Baltimore study, were published after 1989. Preliminary data was available, which clearly showed that the prevalence of glaucoma was much higher in blacks. And then shortly afterwards, about a decade later, the incidence data corroborated that finding. In 1989, I think that there was a lot of discussion about race being a social construct and not biologically relevant. Since then, there's been a couple of advances. We knew about genetic polymorphisms at that time. However, genetic polymorphisms really is more about geography of origin rather than race, and geography of origin and race are not the same thing. So during this time, there was much more information that we now know about geography of origin. And then certainly during this time, the mapping of the human genome in 2003, the HapMap project that looked at genetic variability for disease and disease risk, as well as personal genetic ancestry assessments have kind of influenced how we define race in 2023. In terms of the Human Genome Project, as I mentioned, that was mapped in 2003. The very first person who got their genome identified was the top person here, who's Watson, the Watson from the double helix DNA. He was the initial head of the Human Genome Project before Francis Collins took over. And then in the middle is Craig Ventnor, who had an opposing private company who was trying to map the human genome before the NIH and Watson did. So they were competing with each other. He was the second person to have his genome mapped. And then the fifth person was Dr. Kim, a Korean, who's on the bottom there. And the point of this slide is that these bars, I'm sorry, it's not coming up very well. These bars are genes, and the individual colors represent alleles. And what I'm showing here in the schematic is that Watson and Kim, as well as Kim and Ventnor, who are Asian and white, have more alleles in common than the two white guys, Watson and Ventnor. And if you look at the actual genome and look at the actual alleles, you can see the actual counts here. And I wish this pointer was working, but you can see that between Watson and Kim, there were 569,000 that was in common, whereas the other, in fact, in second was between Kim and Ventnor, 481,000 versus 461,000 that's in common between Ventnor and Watson. Of course, we understood about genetic polymorphisms at that point, and the CYP2C9 polymorphism is one that's talked about a lot because about 100 drugs that we currently use, this particular polymorphism, or particularly cytochrome system, is responsible for catalyzing these drugs. And so obviously it makes a difference if you're a high metabolizer or a low metabolizer. And it's been used, race categorization has been used for this because Asians are poor metabolizers and Caucasians are extensive metabolizers. But look at the bottom there, Ventnor is an extensive metabolizer, as would be expected, it's white. But Watson is a poor metabolizer and has properties that's more akin to the South Korean than to Ventnor. And in fact, his whole genome shows a lot of South Korean. So looking back at ancestry of origin, we all came from the common female ancestor and the common male ancestor in Africa, and then using either mitochondrial DNA or non-recombinant Y chromosome haplotypes. You can see the arc of evolution in terms of how populations branched out from Africa, and then looking at current day, as I mentioned, Y chromosome, non-recombinant Y chromosomes, one can look at the different polymorphisms throughout evolution and map out who or where the ancestors were based on your own variant. So genetic ancestry is not the same as race, although there are some aspects of it that overlap. And we know now that genetic ancestry can confer disease risk via biological mechanisms that at times, though not always, overlaps with race and ethnicity. This can be seen in a large study, epigenetic study of asthma. This was a large study with children who were minorities or ethnic or racial minorities. And Ancestry explains 76% of the total variance in the DNA methylation in that study, so that the assumption was that race and ethnicity as a proxy for socio-environmental exposures may have been responsible for the remaining 24%. So defining race in 2023 is a little bit more complicated, I think, than it was earlier. Certainly, I think that it is a social construct, as I've mentioned already, but it does change over time. For example, the census, which is, every 10 years in the United States, there's always a change in the racial categorization, and it differs by country. And then the commercial genetic testing that many people do is also complicating things. Here, for example, you see Neymar. I know that Susanna is here, and Neymar is a famous Brazilian soccer star, and he caused a little bit of a controversy a few years ago when, in an interview, he said something to the effect that, after all, he's not black. And, I think most of us would say that he's black. And so, again, phenotypically, we would say that, but in his country and his culture, he doesn't consider himself black. And here's 23andMe looking at, my own personal genetics, and, I consider myself black, but I have more genetic variants that's in common with people from Japan than from anywhere else. And it's important because what has happened is that people who get genetic testing in the census, they end up changing how they respond to the census. Many of them now use more than one category in the census, whereas before it was just a particular category. But the genetic testing is influencing how people respond to the racial question on the census. The census itself, as I mentioned, it changes over. Initially in 1790, there wasn't even a category for blacks; it was just slaves. Then in 1850, black first became categorized. The Chinese started coming over to the United States in the 1800s, and they had their categorization. And then in 1980, Hispanic first became considered to be an ethnicity, and then finally in 2010, some other race was added, and that you can check off more than one race, and that's what I was referring to on the people who've taken the genetic testing and get the results like I did, which kind of may go against what you may have thought from a genetic standpoint. Now, there are some difficulties with the current census. I anticipate that it's going to be changed for the 2030 census. There are two areas that I think it's going to change. The first is the Hispanic origin question. The first that talks about the race. The first that talks about whether you're from Hispanic origin. This is the ethnicity question, and then it's followed by the race question. What race are you, regardless of what your ethnicity is? And you can see on the bottom there, it says some other race. The problem is that Hispanics consider themselves to be a separate race. And in fact, 45% of Hispanics answer this two-part Hispanic question by filling out some other race and writing in Hispanic in the bottom there, as opposed to one of the other racial categories. So something that's going to be done there. The other thing that's going to happen is that the MENA group, the Middle Eastern Northern American group, is categorized as white. This is an alumnus of my university, Wayne State University, who wrote a book about the fact that he's trying to get the government to recognize him as not being white. And but right now he's categorized as white. I think that this is going to change in the next census. Already OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, had a task force which recommended that the 2030 census be changed, and that recommendation went out for comment over the past year, and it's almost certainly going to pass. So you have this imperfect, imprecise concept of race, which is not biological, and yet we make decisions based on that in medicine. And that's called race-based medicine. And my premise here is that race-based medicine is bad medicine. Because of the time limitation, I'm not going to talk about the vital controversy, but one of the examples of race-based medicine is measuring the glomerular filtration rate in blacks. There's a correction for that, and what has happened is because of that correction, it overestimates the glomerular filtration rate in a lot of black people who should have been referred for a kidney transplant were not because of a false glomerular filtration rate. This unfortunately is a US phenomenon. No other country in the world does this correction for race. And the National Kidney Foundation, as well as the American Society of Nephrology Task Force, has recommended that race not be used as a modifier. And a number of academic medical centers now are also not using race as a modifier. University of Maryland was the first, that was about in 2020 or 2019, and a number of academic medical centers have now switched. This is an optic nerve of a person who was diagnosed with glaucoma at a young age of 28. You can see two images from 2008 and 2022. These were not selected for any particular reason except that they were available. And then the visual field from 2003 to 2022, relatively stable in both eyes. And again, he developed glaucoma at the age of 28. And that actually is what was me when I was diagnosed when I was a first-year resident and treated myself until 2003. It's chronicled in this book, The Plum Tree Blossoms Even in Winter. And next month will mark my 30th year as dean or president of one or another medical school or university. And the truth of the matter is that I took this academic route because I thought that I was going to go blind and would not have a future in ophthalmology. As it turns out, you saw my visual fields and my optic nerve. There really hasn't been much progression, if at all. And I'm going to actually go back next year, back to doing ophthalmology. So race-based medicine perpetuates a false narrative that race is an essential biological variable, and it translates it into clinical practice. And the thing about it is it promotes racial stereotyping. And I'm going to give you an example of another racial stereotype. This is from a movie in 1998 called White Men Can't Jump. You notice Wesley Snipes there and Woody Harrelson. Woody Harrelson is acts like he can't play ball very well. Wesley Snipes picks him to play with him, and they scam people. They win a lot of money by winning. They won a particular tournament of $5,000, and Wesley Snipes' character challenges Woody Harrelson's character Billy that he can't dunk, and that he can't dunk because he's white, and white men can't jump. And so that's the premise of the movie. It's a stereotype. And this is from the final round of this year's NBA dunk contest at the NBA All-Star team. Trey Murphy is in the finals. It's a tremendous jumper. And you see his second dunk there was 49.2. That meant that he got all 10s except for 1-9. In order for McClung to win, he was going to have to pretty much get a perfect dunk on this one.
This is the high school that he played for. They broke the Iverson and the J.J. Redick records in the state of Virginia. Here he goes. And he's putting on the handle.
Now, those of you who are not dunking aficionados, he did a greater than 360-degree turn in the air and dunked and had a perfect 50. So white men can dunk and can jump. And the other thing about race-based medicine is that it inhibits the need for more precise biomarkers underpinning disparities, and it ignores the overwhelming evidence that social determinants of health are primarily accountable for racial and ethnic health disparities. And social determinants, of course, are those economic and social conditions that influence individual and group differences in health status. I first learned very poignantly about social determinants of health when I was working at the NIH, and I came across some data. This is my neighborhood, Suitland, which is right on the line with Southeast DC, predominantly black neighborhood, lower socioeconomic class. I was working at the NIH at the time, which is Bethesda, 19 miles away, predominantly white, predominantly in one of the most affluent counties in the country. And I found a statistic that the life expectancy of a man living in Southeast DC versus one living in Northwest DC, which is the line between Bethesda and DC, was 19 years. So that a man living where I used to live, where I grew up, would have a 19-year less life expectancy than where I was working at the time at the NIH. So there's considerable overlap between race and social determinants of health, but one has to recognize that bias and systemic racism is also part of this. Fortunately, there's increasing data on socioeconomic variables in glaucoma. This is a study from ELAM, and what it shows is that Medicaid versus commercial health insurance and the tests that you are likely to get, visual fields, optic nerve imaging, and fundus photography, and one can see, with one being the reference line, that all these tests were less likely to be performed if you had Medicaid versus commercial health insurance. But also, very important is the racial aspect of it also. Within each one of these, you can see that black individuals had even less access than either white or Latino individuals. This is data from a PhD thesis that was just defended last month. It's very, very new. And Ken Kitayama from Ann Coleman's group looked at proportion mediated in terms of glaucoma surgical outcomes in terms of socioeconomic status. So socioeconomic status is a mediator for surgical outcomes. And what he found is that for black patients, it mediated 53.8% of the surgical outcomes. But very interestingly, if you controlled for the socioeconomic status by theoretically eliminating socioeconomic status as a variable, the proportion eliminated in terms of the disparity in outcomes was 96.7%, astounding. And then the same thing with Asians, it was 21.6% was mediated by socioeconomic status, but it really was not affected at all in terms of being eliminated by controlling for socioeconomic status. So race is a social construct. I've already mentioned that, but to declare that race is genetically and or biologically meaningless is too simplistic and misleading, and I don't believe that anymore. Genetic ancestry as a variable can capture at least a portion of biological variation between and within groups, and as I've already mentioned, there is a relationship between genetic ancestry and race. There's a lot more information now on genetics than there was in 1989. Certainly by 2017, 16 genomic regions were associated with primary open-angle glaucoma. Unfortunately, they were all in white or Asian populations. More recently, there were studies that looked at black populations. These are large GWAS studies. Adages 3 from Bob Weinreb's group found the novel genetic locus at EN04 associated with primary open-angle glaucoma in the African descent population. The genetics of glaucoma in people of African descent found a amyloid BA4 precursor protein locus that was also associated with African ancestry, but this was not found in the Philadelphia group with Joan O'Brien with the primary open-angle African ancestry glaucoma genetic study. one can speculate why. I think one of the reasons is that the Philadelphia group is much more admixed than the African group. And certainly one of the findings of the Philadelphia study was that higher degrees of African ancestry was associated with increased POAG risk. Bob mentioned the glaucoma polygenic risk score, which is an estimated effect of many genetic variants. I think there's a lot of promise in this. Unfortunately, it is dependent on these large GWAS databases, and so we need to do more studies in more diverse populations in order to make this a robust measure. In terms of data sources, we're shifting now from clinical trials and surveys to real-world data and big data analysis. The IRIS registry from the American Academy is one example of this. The source data repository at the University of Michigan is another. There are others, but I'm just familiar with this one because they're just 30 miles away from my institution. But this is a repository that looks at EMR data from practices, glaucoma practices that use EPIC, and it is depositing all of that information and for further analysis. These large biobanks are now up and running, the UK, FinGen, Biobank Japan, and so forth. Most of them concentrate mainly on the biological specimens, but there's some variable amount of environmental information that's collected also. And then these biobanks are in the range of about 500,000 right now. The NIH All of Us, which was previously called the Precision Medicine Initiative, has an ambitious goal of collecting specimens from 1 million Americans, but it's not just specimens. They have a lot of environmental data, lifestyle data, wearable sensors, some of the things that Bob was talking about. They're trying to collect all of this information so that one can look at the influence not only of genetics, but also environment, lifestyle, behavior, all of these things into glaucoma risk. In 2003, I wrote an article which basically questioned the use of race classification in medicine, and I asked, was it valid? The bottom line is I didn't think that it was. I thought it was a pseudoscientific concept. But having said that, race is not irrelevant in medicine. One can see from this picture here an uprising between people supporting white supremacy and Black Lives Matter. In our society, it's just I worried a little bit about whether this talk was going to be too focused on the United States, and that this might be more of a United States problem. But I do think that bias and racism and the disproportionate allocation of resources as a result of socioeconomic status is something that is worldwide. And certainly in the United States, there was a false narrative of the post-racial society after Barack Obama was elected president, but that I think was a fallacy. Racism at both individual and systems level is alive and well. There was a National Academy study that just came out that I was a part of, which was advancing anti-racism, diversity, and equity in STEM organizations like universities. And it focused a lot on the systemic reasons why there's a difference between blacks and whites in terms of achievement in STEM. And one of the things that it focused on was systemic things like redlining in Detroit. Redlining, for those of you who aren't familiar, is in the 1930s. In order to get a loan from a bank for home ownership, you had to live in an area that was designated as green by the Homeowners Loan Corporation. And if you were in an area that was designated as red, you couldn't get a loan. So that's why it's called redlining. You can see the areas designated red and green there. The important point is that this persists, the influence of this redlining persists even now, where you can see the original colors there, but superimposed on that is where people of different races live now. And those areas that had redlined have a predominance of people of color. and those who were not redlined had predominantly wealthier. Here's an example of an actual wall that separated redlined areas versus not redlined areas. Now it's a commemorative mural. But what's important is that it has insidious effects, including health effects. Here is 202 redlining maps drawn in the 1930s, and you can see superimposed on that is air pollution in 2010. It increases within the 1930s redlining grade. So the worse the grade, the worse the air quality, and that affects everything else from distribution of resources, school taxes, and where kids are educated, and so forth. So moving forward to what I think about the future, race is becoming less relevant in medicine, and part of the reason is that there's much more genetic admixture. In California, babies born between 2011 and 2015, only 47% of those babies would have had concordant racial parents. In other words, most would have had discordant racial parents. These two pictures here are pictures from commercials done in the United States. And those of you who look at commercials, please look at these types of commercials, because every time there's a couple that is portrayed and in a commercial these days, it's almost invariably interracial couple. The first one, the top one there, is a commercial for Old Navy. The bottom one there, which I think is even more provocative, is a black man asking a white woman to marry him, is State Farm insurance. It has nothing to do with jewelry or anything else. It's just, State Farm insurance. But for some reason, marketers are focusing on making sure that that the messages they portray are more contemporary. And mark my word, when you look at, if you pay attention, you'll see that most of these commercials that have couples are mixed, which is remarkable, because when you think about when I was born to mixed parents, that was unlawful to have mixed marriages. In fact, it wasn't until 14 years later that the Loving case made it legal for two people from different racial backgrounds to marry in Virginia. So all of this is going to what Bob was mentioning, that all this bigger and bigger data allows more of a focus on the individual, and you can then look at the effect of genes, the environment, social determinants, lifestyle on health and disease risk, and all of that in turn then points toward what he called Spartan medicine, what many of us know is either personalized or precision medicine, and I think we're going in that direction so that race actually becomes less relevant. So I'll conclude there, and again, thank you, Neeru, for the invitation, and thank you for your attention.